The history of indigenous cinema in the United States. In order to understand the social, cultural, and political context of Native American cinema, we must first look at the anthropological origins of indigenous people of the Americas, as well as their specific history within the U.S. Scientists generally believe that indigenous Americans were originally people from East Asia who began to migrate further eastward about 23,000 years ago. They crossed a natural land bridge over the Bering Strait, which connected North America and Asia, around where Alaska and Siberia are on the map. This land bridge no longer exists, but it did back then, and approximately 18,000 years ago was when these indigenous people crossed and arrived to settle the North American continent. About 13,000 years ago was when the genetic split happened and we divide the Northern Amerindians from the Southern Amerindians on their respective continents, North and South America. Over the millennia, indigenous civilizations were formed in various nations and tribes. In the U.S. region, historically, we divide them into different geographic areas: the eastern woodlands, the southeast, Great Plains, southwest, Great Basin, the Plateau, northwest coast, and California and Alaska. These tribes are just some of the ones that exist in the region, such as the Iroquois, the Cherokee, Sioux, Comanche, Navajo, Apache, etc., but it is certainly not all of them. There are more detailed maps that exist, and I will share one in the link below. Going back to a larger overview of indigenous peoples to understand the scope of the destruction they faced over the last 5 centuries, most experts and historians today estimate that there were between 75 to 100 million indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere on both continents in the pre-Columbian era, possibly as high as 145 million. In the area north of Mexico, that is the United States and Canada, between 8 and 18 million indigenous people are believed to have existed at its peak, around the eve of European landfall in 1492. According to a study at Yale, the island on which Columbus first landed, Hispaniola, was approximately populated by several 100,000 to over 1 million indigenous Taino people. By 1514, just 25 years after Columbus arrived, only 32,000 Taino people survived in Hispaniola, with most of the population having died from enslavement, massacre, or disease. Across the entire North American continent, one can simply extrapolate, with only some 2.7 million Native Americans in the U.S. today and 1.6 million in Canada, that the depopulation was vast and done by these very means: genocide, slavery, ethnic cleansing, economic upheaval, and disease, all driven by European imperialism and working in concert to decimate native civilization. The guiding philosophy of the U.S.'s Western expansion in the 19th century that sought to justify and continue this destruction was called manifest destiny, the belief that American settlers were destined to expand across the frontier. This manifested itself through policies of the Indian Removal Act, wars and massacres, and treaties negotiated between native tribes and the U.S. government that were later broken and which deprived native people of their rights, their lands, their resources, and their livelihoods. By the end of the 19th century, nearly every corner of native society, reaching all the way to the Pacific, had been either destroyed, uprooted, or greatly diminished. The end of the 19th century also marked the beginnings of cinema. As such, the first footage of Native Americans on film goes back to 1895. It may come as a surprise that there happened to be a few Native American filmmakers that emerged in this era. The most prominent of them may be James Youngdeer, the first known Native American film producer. Youngdeer achieved some stature in the industry as general manager of the Pathé Frères West Coast studio from 1911 to 14, one of the largest production companies in the world at the time. He oversaw the production of more than 100 one-reel silent westerns and worked alongside D.W. Griffith and other big-name producers in this dawn age of Hollywood. His most well-known film was The White Fawn's Devotion, starring real Native American actors in roles. It portrayed an interracial marriage between a Native woman and a white British man, and it is one of the first and only positive and sympathetic depictions of a Native woman that exists in this era. Other Native filmmakers in this time were Edwin Carraway and Luther Standing Bear. Native Americans even got a chance to play co-leads in movies, such as in The Squaw Man, before they went on to be the go-to villains in movies. On that note, for much of the intervening century between the late 19th to the late 20th, there isn't much authentic Native American storytelling in films. Much of the discourse found in researching this period is about the problematic and harmful stereotypes that proliferated in the industry, most notably in the popular Western genre. The cowboys and Indians narrative frequently depicted natives as wild or savage villains. Other stereotypes included beautiful exotic maidens who were often married to white men, stoic Indians and magical medicine men, friends and allies to the white savior, and natives living in the wild on reservations in rural areas. And there was the frequent casting of white actors in native roles, such as Jeff Chandler, a white actor who received an Oscar nomination for playing an Apache. Even in the relatively recent past, films like Pocahontas and Indian in the Cupboard persisted with these caricatures. Effectively, a century of these dehumanizing images coincided and correlated with the destruction of Native society in real life, whose communities continue to be afflicted by racism, neglect, alienation, and crippling economic inequality. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that there was a shift. Certainly, it was a period of enormous social, cultural, and political change in the U.S. around race relations, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which included rights for Native Americans. Another critical piece of legislation was the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, which was part of the government's Indian termination policy seeking to end the tribal status of many indigenous groups and cause significant numbers of Native Americans to move into urban areas. Changes in cinema soon followed. Initially, it was the white Hollywood industry that started to evolve, with their revisionist westerns which sought to undo the harmful tropes of the classic genre. Films such as Little Big Man and Soldier Blue often portrayed Native Americans as victims and white people as villains and aggressors. An interesting example from this time was the hybrid docudrama The Exiles from 1961. Made by English filmmaker Kent Mackenzie, it depicted the lives of Native Americans living in the Bunker Hill neighborhood of Los Angeles, a historically working-class immigrant and native area, until it was razed in the name of urban renewal. Striking for showing Native Americans not on rural reservations but in a major American city, the film was praised for its urban realism and its authentic illustration of Native American life in the city. The 1980s saw the emergence of independent cinema, and with it, a birth of authentic storytelling for Native Americans in film. A standout example from this decade was Powwow Highway, a buddy road trip movie that genuinely depicted contemporary Native American life on reservations and addressed problems such as poverty, racism, and intertribal conflict. In 1992, the film Geronimo, an American Legend, was not a Native-made film but a big-budget Hollywood movie that was nonetheless praised by Native American groups for centering a dignified portrayal of an important historical figure, played by actor Wes Studi. Then in 1998, there were two notable films. The first, Naturally Native, a drama about three Native sisters trying to start their own business, premiered at Sundance. Despite this, the film's maker, Valerie Redhorse, struggled to find a distributor, and it was ultimately released directly to video. The second film, Smoke Signals, also premiered at Sundance that year, and is regarded as the first film written, produced, and directed by and starring all Native Americans to reach a wide audience nationally and abroad. This comedy-drama road trip movie, reminiscent of Powwow Highway, is about two brothers coming to terms with their troubled family past, and deals with the contemporary injustices and issues of Native American life. Here's a short clip from the film.
Me and my boy Victor, we were playing 2-on-2 basketball against these Jesuits. These Jesuits had on their white collars and their black robes, and they were pretty damn good. By the way they were playing, I could have swore they had 7 out of 12 apostles on their side. Because every time I tried to shoot the ball, there was a storm of locusts come flying in and blind me. Now I was shooting in the dark, I tell you. But my boy Victor, he was magic. He couldn't miss. Those Jesuits didn't have a prayer stopping him fair and square. Victor was only 12 years old and kind of small, so those Jesuits were beating up on him real good. They were beating up on him and chanting at him like he was possessed or something. Maybe Victor was possessed by the spirit of Jim Thorpe because he had this look in his eye and he was mean. Come on, Victor, I shouted. Come on, Victor. We're up against the Son and the Father here. And these two are going to need the Holy Ghost to beat us. I mean, the score was all tied up. Next basket wins, you know. So the Jesuits had the ball. And this great big redhead Jesuit come driving in and knocked my boy over. My boy, he was tough. You gotta have faith, son. Faith. Next basket wins. And he took it to the hoop. And he flew, man. He flew right over that Jesuit. 12 years old, and he was like some kind of indigenous angel or something. Except maybe his wings were made out of TV dinner trays. My boy Victor, he was the man that day. He took that shot, and he won that game. It was the Indians versus the Christians that day. And for at least one day, the Indians won. Whee!
Smoke Signals was written by renowned Native American author Sherman Alexie and directed by Chris Eyre, who won the Filmmakers Trophy at Sundance for this film. Chris Eyre, a Cheyenne and Arapaho tribe member, is one of many Native American filmmakers working today. Some of his other works include the films Skins, The Doughboy, and Imprint. Another accomplished filmmaker, Sterling Harjo, who is of Seminole Muskogee descent, has made films such as Barking Water and Four Sheets to the Wind. The latter film depicts the lives of a brother and sister in a Seminole Creek community in Oklahoma as they deal with the suicide of their father. Sidney Freeland, a Navajo transgender filmmaker, has made films such as Deirdre and Laney Rob a Train, which is on Netflix, and Drunktown's Finest, which is a drama centered on 3 Navajo characters in New Mexico and their struggles living on the reservation, including one transgender Native woman who faces prejudice in her own community. Many Native American actors have achieved mainstream success, and some have become household names. Actors such as Wes Studi, Kimberly Guerrero, Graham Greene, Irene Bedraud, August Schellenberg, and others have collaborated with many of the aforementioned Native American directors and writers and have had opportunities to portray fully realized Indigenous characters in authentically told Indigenous stories. Other films worthy of mention here are the 1996 film Grand Avenue, written by Native writer Greg Saris and one of the first films to feature a Native American actress in a lead role, and the 2015 film Songs My Brothers Taught Me, directed by Chloe Zhao, which centers on young people living in the Pine Ridge Reservation. Many of the previously mentioned Native filmmakers, such as Chris Eyre, Sterling Harjo, and Sidney Freeland, have had their films premiere at the Sundance Film Festival and won awards there. For over 25 years, Sundance has had a dedicated Native American and Indigenous program to develop and produce the works of Native American filmmakers. There is also the American Indian Film Institute in San Francisco, which has been producing the annual American Indian Film Festival, which first began in the late 1970s and has given a platform to Indigenous-made films from the US and Canada since. Institutions like these, along with a growing social and cultural consciousness of marginalized groups and their history, have helped to create a more flourishing environment in these last few decades for Native American artists than in times prior. And there is still a long way to go in acknowledging these centuries-long injustices that have debilitated Indigenous representation in our media and art. But today's Native American filmmakers are a rapidly growing cohort, and they are creating works that deal with the complexity of Indigenous life in the U.S., with many showing a pride of heritage and offering a critical look at the state of their communities and their place in the world.